Well, that's a first. We got a fire. Welcome back to the Lost Cause Ranch. Today we are back working on the Range Rover Camper with our 1-ton axle swap. That is right, we are getting rid of these little guys in favor of something much, much stronger. I mean, the Range Rover Camper is a freaking behemoth of a thing, and we need to make sure it doesn't skip leg day. And these nice, strong shafts out of our 14-bolt GM axle require a housing that is much larger than the factory Land Rover. Today, to make it work, we're gonna trim that guy down to size. So upgrading the camper to the 8-lug axles out of a 3/4 ton Chevy is going to have many benefits. These are obviously going to be stronger, less chance of breaking something versus the factory Land Rover axles, which once you put a big tire on it, can turn to glass. In addition to that extra strength, these are much wider, which in the case of the Range Rover Camper is a very good thing. We're going to be able to go back to a more normal offset wheel versus the super low negative offset that it currently has to accommodate that wide and tall camper shell. But there is one big downfall to swapping it over to these guys, and big is the key word. When we take a look at the rear axle, the 14-bolt, we have an issue in this area. If we take a straight edge across the bottom of the differential carrier and we go to the center of the tube, we are at 7 inches. And if we move over to our Discovery / Range Rover and do the same thing. This is a little tougher because there's much more in the way, including my arm. But that puts us at 5 inches to the center of the axle. Why does that figure matter? Well, here is a 35-inch tire, the same size that the Range Rover Camper originally had before we got it. Currently has a 33-inch tire, which would make this problem even worse. But if we take our 35-inch tire and we measure that tire out, it currently measures out at 34 inches. Depending on the brand of tires, it's pretty typical for it to measure under the actual number size, which means if we mount this guy up, we have 17 inches from the center of the wheel to the ground. And with that 35-inch tire mounted on the factory axle, that means our clearance from the ground to the bottom of the differential would be 12 inches. We take that 17 inches minus the 5 inches to the center line, and that gives us 12. And if we do that with our 14-bolt, that figure was 7 inches, which means we would only have 10 inches of ground clearance from the bottom of this to the ground. Ground clearance would be the clearance to the ground. That makes sense. But that's a little bit of a problem. And that problem only gets exacerbated. I don't know if that's the right word. But that problem only gets exacerbated. See, I try and use some big words to look smart, and it usually backfires. So we'll just go with, but that problem only gets worse when you go off-roading and air this tire down for more traction. Because when you air it down, the sidewall compresses more, which shrinks up that ground clearance even more. You may remember in the last video on the camper, I did say that we are not going to go back to the originally designed 35-inch tire, but we are going to go to an even larger 37-inch tire. We are probably going to step that up to a 37-inch tire, which helps us out in the ground clearance part, being 2 inches bigger. But when you split that on each side of the tire, that gives us 1 inch of additional ground clearance going to a 37-inch tire, which means switching over to this 1-ton axle, we're still going to be at a 1-inch deficit. Now, the camper is a big thing, and it's not going to be doing hardcore wheeling and crazy off-roading, but it is going to take on some trails. It is going to see some obstacles, and I really want to make it as capable as possible. So before we go on with making our mounting tabs to locate the factory springs and radius arms onto these guys, we need to address the clearance issue. To do that, we need to open this guy up. I just love the smell of some gear lube. Well, that was frickin' stupid. I guess that's one way to drain it. So to remedy this clearance problem, we're gonna do what is called a shave. And how we're gonna do that is take a couple measurements here. 5 1/8, 5 1/8. Is draw a line right across there. So we made our little Sharpie mark, or should I say Inksol mark, and that is going to be our cut line. We are going to slice the bottom of the differential housing. We're going to take that lip and discard it. The bottom part that we're cutting off is 1.5 inches thick, and we're going to bust the plasma table out and add back a 1/2 inch flat plate right on the bottom there, which will gain us a full inch of clearance. And if you step back in our calculations, this 14 bolt differential has 2 inches less clearance than the factory differential. So we're going to gain 1 inch here. That gets us down to 1 inch. And if we go to 37-inch tires, that gains us another inch on the bottom side of that tire, which puts us back to the exact clearance the Range Rover Camper originally had with 35-inch tires. That means we'll be able to get over so many obstacles. So we're just going to get the differential itself out of the way. So we got a little extra room to work with. This is what they call a full floater axle, which is kind of nice. The wheel's not going to fall off when we decide to break an axle on this guy. Now that the screw adjusters are out of the way, we should just be able to lift this guy out. Now, none of this stuff is actually going to get used in the final iteration when it goes into the camper. The differential is going to be gone because we definitely want to install a locker so everything spins as one, kind of like both sides are locked together. And then this ring gear and pinion aren't going to fly either. This currently has a 373 ratio, which if we were to put 37-inch tires on a 4.6 liter Land Rover, coupled with that big behemoth sitting on the back, we'd be going nowhere quick. So this is probably going to get something in the neighborhood of a 488 or a 513 gear. I'm leaning more towards like a 513. I'd rather give up some top speed and have some better low range for those hardcore off-road situations that the camper's obviously going to see. Now comes the fun part. That right there is one heck of a chunk of steel. And we had to switch over to the corded grinder because, as always, my mind is more ambitious than the battery is long. You just chew through them when doing things like this. But I just freaking hate cords anymore. Screwdrivers are always the best pry bars. Close. Good hammer as well. I guess we can use a real pry bar at this point. Would you look at that? There we go. So that was a little bit of work. Now, if I had a bigger mill than this little guy here, I would have clamped it in that and probably just milled off this little section here. And it would have been much cleaner, less work, and probably a little bit nicer finish. But like all of us, including you and myself, we usually just have to make do with what we got. And this did it. Now it is CAD time. That is right. Our cardboard. We're going to set this guy here and we're going to make up a little bit of a template, just like that. As you saw there, I already had it drawn out because I didn't turn the camera on the first time. But we're going to trim this down. Then we'll trim it down some more. I think we're getting pretty close. We'll trim these flanges down a tad more. And right there is going to be our little steel piece. We're going to overlap the bolts on both sides for strength. And then we're leaving ourselves enough room all the way around to put a nice weld bead to make that nice and strong. We don't want to bash it off a rock and have that go flying, puke all our diff fluid everywhere. That is the first time cutting some 1/2 inch on the table. Did half decent. It's got a little bit of taper on one side of the cut. That is more the case of worn consumables in that guy. And then these corners are kind of burned in. I was running a little slower than you probably should, but I want to make sure it cut through it. But backside of the cut, nice and clean. Just had to knock the slag off on the edge of the table and hit it with a flap disc. No real cleanup, but I'm mighty impressed with how this little guy's been doing. And there's our cardboard template. I cleaned the file up a little bit on the computer, but I think that should work out pretty well. So I went ahead and threw a bevel on the housing and on our plate. Not a huge bevel, but just something we can run a bead in there and flush out for the mating surface of the diff cover. So we're just gonna line this guy up. We're gonna leave a little edge protruding on the gasket sealing side, and we'll grind that flush. That looks sufficient. All right, so this guy is a pretty hefty chunk of steel between the 1/2 inch plate and this massive housing. So before we weld it, we're gonna burn it. And what we're gonna do is weld this end of it first because the housing is much thinner than the rear. So by welding this first, we're gonna introduce a bunch more heat into this thick part before we weld it. Now this isn't gonna hold a building up, but we don't need a rock to just knock it off. Now, I'm by no means an expert at MIG welding, especially the thicker stuff. I much prefer to TIG weld. That's what I primarily use. But being we got that new little Everlast MIG, figured we do it that way. I'm guessing that guy will hold. But we're going to go ahead and clean this up, round the edge, give us no sharp edges to catch on rocks and logs and whatever else we may decide to run over. Then we're going to flip this guy over and buzz the inside to make sure it's solid. There it is, mostly smoothed out. When we go ahead and smooth out and fill the divots on the tube, we'll finish this guy out because we'll get a Scotch-Brite pad on that guy to make it really pretty. But there's the backside mostly worked in. We'll resurface the entire gasket area once this is all finished out. That right there is a fair amount of difference. And we also have a nice smooth place to skid off of versus catching that lip. You see we had like a 1-inch lip that was just a straight edge to hang up on things. We're gonna run a bead around the inside of this. That one's more just for sealing this guy up. Granted, it shouldn't leak through there, but it never hurts to double your protection up. So that should be all the welding we need to do for the shave. We're gonna set the carrier back in though to make sure everything clears. It'd be less than ideal if it didn't. And we have about 3/8 of an inch of clearance to the bottom of the ring gear. So I think we're sufficient there. Now there is companies out there with kits to shave these 14 bolts that gain you an extra like 3/4 of an inch versus what I did here. But that requires machining the ring gear down, which we have the lathe over there. So that was a pretty simple possibility for us to do. But the camper isn't going to be that hardcore of a wheeling rig. This inch we gained without having to modify the ring gear and leaving that guy full, along with leaving the OE housing as possible, will work out perfectly. But we do have one dilemma now, and that's this guy. It kind of hangs a little on the low side. It's also just some thin sheet metal. So we went ahead and drew up a new diff cover, one that's a little more fitting than this guy, mainly in that area. We're ready to cut that guy out of some steel, but before we do that, we are going to make sure my drawing skills aren't in question and test the file with some cardboard. Well, that's a first. We got a fire. Well, that didn't work. Suppose we should remove this from the area. And, feel like I'm in Billy Madison. He called the shit poop. Good thing we got freezing rain to take care of that. We'll just set it over there where it can't do a whole lot of damage. This one seems to be going a tad better. A lot less fire going on. Much better. So there's our flange, and if we set it on there, it looks like it lines right up with those holes. It's a touch long on the bottom, but I did that on purpose. Once it's bolted on, we'll take the flap disc and clearance it flush. Now the moment of truth is this guy. And I'd say that looks pretty good as well. We're not sitting flush with the cardboard, obviously, and it's sitting at 4 inches. We need somewhere around 3.5 for clearance. So I think that is sufficient. Only problem with this guy is it's probably not gonna hold fluid too well. These should be a tad bit stronger than the cardboard and a tad bit better than the factory stamped steel unit. The only problem is we currently do not have a method or an easy one to bend this guy. Our sheet metal brake here just isn't quite up to the task. So what we're gonna do is mark some lines out on where it needs to bend. And what we're gonna do with those lines is slice a relief mark, essentially a score mark, so we can bend them right where they need to be. Now if we cut far enough into these, we should be able to bend them. Just kind of like that. Might need some technical taps. Getting closer. A little more tweaking. All right, we got this guy tapped into place close enough to where we can start clamping and tacking. That came together half decent. Now I could have made this all in separate pieces, but this way we keep a nice uniform shape throughout it. We'll obviously weld across these, smooth that out, and it'll be good to go. That should work. Let's see if it fits. And it looks like it does. This right here is quite the welding bench. So there is our stronger diff cover tacked together. That ended up pretty nice. Tad bit beefier than the factory one. I would say this is twice as heavy as this guy. So the camper's gonna be even slower than it was before, but we need to see if all this clears that. Now we'll have to take a drill bit and chase all the holes. I cut them slightly undersized, being the plasma doesn't make a true round hole. But we can partially thread a couple of them in there. But what we need to do is spin the diff and make sure we aren't hitting anything on the center here. And it looks like we are clear. So there is the full shave and new diff cover mocked up. We just need to trim this guy about 1/8 of an inch. And that little setup is gonna give us the clearance we need to go back to having the same amount of clearance as the camper on 35-inch tires and these factory axles. That CNC plasma, along with the CNC laser, do make things like this quite a bit easier to tackle in the shop. Now we just need to clean up the tubes and get all our points mocked up off the factory axle. But that'll be on the next video next week when we continue our 1-ton axle swap in the Range Rover Camper. But this was a necessary thing to take care of before these behemoths go under there. So we're now sitting in pretty good shape to get these guys installed in the camper in the very near future. It's gonna be wonderful to have a nice wide, strong set of axles sitting under that thing. Something a tad less fragile. And I just can't get over how much I love using that little laser to mock everything up. And looking at this, give me a little bit of an idea. If any of you out there do some airbrushing, get a hold of me. With that being said, appreciate you guys watching. Appreciate you subscribing. We will catch you next time where we are going to move this process along some more and get our jig made up to locate all the factory bits onto these guys. And in some other unfortunate news, I bet you cannot guess which one needs that. Got her to the wood right now. Poor little guy.